I, along with my junior, Ms. Sickland, act in this matter on behalf of Peter Francis. Mr. Francis is grateful for the opportunity to make an opening statement. But can I say at the outset that this will be a reasonably brief statement, despite the fact that in all probability, this public inquiry would not be sitting here today if Mr. Francis had not told the truth about what he saw with his own eyes, heard with his own ears, and learnt as a result of his personal experience from his years as an undercover police officer. There are three reasons, Sir John, why his opening statement today will be reasonably short. First, Mr. Francis' expertise is as a serving and now retired special branch officer. He is not a politician or a policymaker. He can only offer assistance to this inquiry based on his experience as a former serving police officer. Whilst he was deployed undercover, Mr. Francis pretended to be a left-wing campaigner. But today, he is not a campaigner and has no desire to become a campaigner. Secondly, Mr. Francis has already paid a very high price for his openness about the time when he served as an undercover police officer. To date, he has still not been assured that he will not face criminal prosecution under the Official Secrets Act for the public interest disclosures that he made that led to this inquiry. Now, those outside the police service might regard that as an entirely theoretical issue. However, those outside the police may not be aware of the impact of Regulation K5 of the Police Pensions Regulations 1987, which allow a chief constable, or in this case the commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, to remove the police pension of a former police officer who is convicted of such offences. Mr. Francis thus still faces the potential of a criminal prosecution for the disclosures he originally made, despite the fact that they are so obviously in the public interest, and as a result faces the threat of the loss of his pension, which is his only income in retirement. Mr. Francis has already upset the police establishment by revealing wrongdoing that others would have preferred to remain secret. Unknowingly, he followed the Chancery dictum that there is no confidence in the disclosure of iniquity. He has sought assurances from the Metropolitan Police Service that he will not be prosecuted for his original public interest disclosures, and which led to the setting up of this inquiry, but has received none. He thus continues to face the prospect of paying a very high personal and financial price for acting in the public interest. Now, whilst we understand that giving assurances about prosecutions may be difficult, we invite the Commissioner to give a cast iron guarantee, absolute assurance that no action will be taken against Mr. Francis, or that his police pension will be removed because of his past disclosures. And we invite that commitment to be given before he gives evidence in person to this inquiry. The third reason why this will be a short statement is because Mr. Francis wishes to reserve what he has to say in detail to his statement of evidence. Time is marching on, and he's invited the inquiry to take that evidence, but to date, he's not been asked to provide a statement. He simply observes that the sooner he's asked to give a statement, the more he'll be able to recall and the more accurate will be his recollections. Whilst not being a policymaker or campaigner, Mr. Francis does wish to make a number of things clear. First, he considers and has always considered that undercover policing has the capacity to be a legitimate tactic in the right circumstances. And those who deprecate the use of any undercover policing will not find he is an ally. Secondly, he considers that policing can only be carried out in a democracy in a transparent manner and with the broad consent of the population. That transparency, the right for the public to know the truth of what is being done on their behalf, is very important to him. He accepts, of course, that at the time that an undercover operation is being undertaken, the actions of the undercover police officers cannot be transparent. However, given that transparency in policing is vitally important to maintain public consent, one of the issues the inquiry will have to consider is when it is appropriate to inform people that individuals that they thought were friends and colleagues were in fact sent by the state to lie and mislead them in order to obtain evidence of criminality. And the need for transparency means that keeping the lid on the box permanently should not be an option. The question about who should know, what they should know, and when disclosure should be made is way beyond Mr. Francis's expertise. But he feels that the truth must come out in a timely manner because citizens cannot be lied to by the state with impunity. There must come a time when the state comes clean to explain who has been lied to and why, and to justify their actions. Thirdly, Mr. Francis's belief is that police organisations are only entitled to lie, to cheat and deceive members of the public in the public interest if, firstly, those undertaking these functions are subject to the strictest level of supervision and governance arrangements, and secondly, that the underlying criminality is sufficient to justify state-sponsored deception. During the time when he worked for the Metropolitan Police Service, the MPS, it was perfectly clear to him that the MPS as an institution did not have sufficient integrity, governance arrangements, and insights into the effect of undercover policing on both officers and those who were subject to surveillance to be trusted to carry out undercover operations which balance the interests of the force and the interests of those who were the victims of state-sponsored deception. Now, it will be a matter for the inquiry to determine whether the MPS has sufficiently transformed its approach to undercover policing so that it can now be trusted with this role. That's an issue for which recommendations will have to be made by the inquiry in due course. All Mr. Francis can do is to explain the shortfalls he observed and to draw attention to the fact that any assurances of reform behaviour need to be treated with considerable circumspection if claims are being made to that effect by people whose job it is to lie on behalf of the state. Lastly, and really importantly, Mr. Francis is concerned that this inquiry should gain a profound understanding of the burden of long-term psychological distress shouldered by those undertaking undercover work. The effects on those who do this work reverberate for many years into the future. His experience is the duty of care owed by the police to its members is routinely breached because the MPS fails to understand the psychological toll taken by those who are required to lie and deceive to others as part of the day job. It's hardly surprising that in a public service such as the police, where truth is rightly expected of all police officers, those whose job it is to live untruths for extended periods of time will find themselves in the psychological shadows. He's concerned that this inquiry should properly understand the world through the perspective of an undercover police officer. He looks forward to clear recommendations being made concerning the level of psychological support to be provided to those who are called on to do this most difficult of work. That support must be commensurate with the psychological strains which inevitably arise for those who were asked to live a double life for the benefit of society, and it must recognise that those effects continue for a long time. Mr. Francis joined the special branch of the MPS in 1990 and became a serving member of its ultra-secret Special Demonstration Squad, the SDS, between 1993 and 1997, which is a period of interest to this inquiry. His understanding was that the general remit of the SDS was originally to prevent public disorder during demonstrations, and that this was the sole justification for targeting individuals and political organizations perceived to be subversive or extremist, namely a threat to the state. His experience is that those targeted by the SDS was perceived to be subversives working against the concept of the state. But the targeting appeared to equate the state and what was perceived to be in the interests of the state with the policies and the convenience of the government of the day, together with the policies and convenience of those with substantial interests in the private sector. Hence, for example, the SDS began targeting those who expressed opposition to the war in Vietnam, a policy of a foreign government, not even one which is the official policy of the UK government. At inception, the focus was limited to what now might be described as the extreme left. This chimes with the annual reports we've seen, the first of which, dated 1969, includes a document from the Special Branch Chief Superintendent, which disclosed its aims to A, to supply information about the intentions of militant left-wing extremists on the occasion of public demonstrations, B, identification of those who engage in preliminary planning or take part in such demonstrations, C, obtaining evidence and identifying suspects in relation to breaches of the law before, during, and after demonstrations, and D, gathering and recording information for long-term intelligence purposes. In relation to the results aspect of D, the language of the report reflects the binary thinking of that time, with, Mr. Francis would suggest, no regard for individual rights. It says, new entrants to the extreme left-wing political scene are being identified and recorded within weeks of their manifesting an interest in extremist affairs. Personal descriptions, addresses, and occupations are obtained by officers working within groups, and this material is submitted personally or passed to officers engaged in normal inquiry work. A balanced view is thus obtained of these individuals from two aspects. New groups are being dealt with similarly. Over 200 information reports have been submitted, and over 1,000 minor meetings attended, in addition to coverage at major demonstrations. Of course, at this time, the fundamental right to freedom of expression, including, of course, protesting against the policies of the government of the day, and to private and family life, were not enshrined in our legal system in the way that they are now. Nevertheless, this inquiry will, he trusts, be determining whether such incursions on individual rights were ever justified by the seriousness of potential criminality, even within the socio-political context of that time. We note in passing that none of the groups were proscribed organizations. And whilst internal police views of what constitutes a threat to the nation at any given time inevitably changes depending on the political compass of the government of the day and the challenging political, cultural, and social landscape, Mr. Francis's firm view is that it is never justifiable to target and spy on non-violent political campaigning groups. Mr. Francis felt compelled to leave the MPS in 2001, following the very significant toll on his psychological well-being that undercover policing had taken. His fragile mental health was a direct consequence of his exposure to the requirements of the job. Legend building was not just a game. Doing the job properly meant you could not slip in and out of your cover. It meant living a profound lie for most of his life, which meant the real Peter Francis was forced to retreat. This is something Mr. Francis can and will talk about when the time comes. Whilst the public stories of undercover policing during the life of the SDS rightly focus on the many victims of this barely and badly regulated state surveillance and the resultant damage to members of the public, dedicated officers like Mr. Francis were also failed by the state. There was no emotional or psychological support on offer to him or his fellow officers. In order to get the MPS to recognise the very significant damage it did to him, he had to resort to litigation, which, as is well recorded, was settled in 2006. Mr. Francis began his journey of disclosure on the 14th of March 2010 as Officer A. He took the decision that ordinary people should know about the tactics used by the SDS, because the public have a right to know what is done in their name and paid for by their taxes. He wanted people to judge for themselves whether they considered the conduct of the SDS was acceptable. His face was in silhouette, his voice distorted, although he was only thinly disguised. By 2011, The Guardian had published articles on undercover practices, naming the source as Peter Black, and in 2013, he unmasked himself as Peter Francis in the Channel 4 Dispatches documentary, The Police's Dirty Secret. Many have asked him why he chose to make the disclosures and when he did, or indeed at all. In one question and answer session in June 2013, he said this: "I didn't want to go to prison. I have been personally threatened on several occasions that if I ever talked about my work in the Special Branch, and especially the Special Demonstration Squad, I would be prosecuted under the Official Secrets Act. The reason I've come forward now is partially because I cannot imagine in the present context the Director of Public Prosecutions bringing a case against a whistleblower revealing important information that's in the public interest. But the main reason is that since having my nervous breakdown in 2001, a result of the stresses of the deployment, and my failed attempts to reintegrate myself into the police service as Peter Black, I now only reach a position where I feel I am mentally and physically strong enough to be able to deal with whatever they might throw at me." Peter Francis's main cover identity was Peter Black, and he struggled with becoming Peter Francis again. His understandable desire to find himself again partly precipitated his decision to disclose. He said this, and similar at various points. The impact psychologically to this day is I feel more like Peter Black than I do Peter Francis. But maybe participation in blowing the whistle will one day allow me to fully move on and become Peter Francis again. In 2018, as part of this inquiry process, he confirmed he did not seek any kind of anonymity, and he revealed his third cover name for the first time, and that name was associated with a deceased child. He had not made that disclosure earlier out of respect for the family of the child, but in making that last revelation, he was publicly speaking the truth. Mr. Francis's sole motivation for disclosing the inner workings of the SDS as he experienced them, whatever factions of the media might have said at the time, and whatever others may say in due course, is that the public have the right to know the truth. It is why he has patiently waited for the inquiry to establish an objective truth. Both the late Sir Christopher Pitchford, the former chair of this inquiry, and the current chair have underlined the importance of seeking out the truth, however difficult, however deeply buried within and beneath the secrecy. This is the obvious task of any chair of any public inquiry, but particularly so in this one, where the purpose is to examine secrecy against the background of the Right Honourable Theresa May's establishment in 2014, when she said, "I do not say this lightly, but the greatest possible scrutiny is now needed into what has taken place. Given the gravity of what has now been uncovered, I have decided that a public inquiry led by a judge is necessary to investigate undercover policing and the operation of the SDS. Only a public inquiry will be able to get to the full truth behind the matters of huge concern contained in Mark Ellison's report. Now, some of the disclosures that Mr. Francis made all those years ago, and which Operation Hearn recorded as allegations, have already been proven to be truths. There is now no doubt that SDS officers engaged in sexual relations whilst deployed, and that the SDS used deceased children's identities in the creation of their covert identities. Operation Hearn had to accept this to be true, although it was at pains to point out that such a practice was not unlawful in the sense that it broke the criminal law. But that asked the wrong question because it looked at the issue far too narrowly. It plainly was unlawful, and then it breached the human rights of those unwittingly caught up in these police activities, as the payouts to some victims have tacitly recognised. This inquiry will scrutinise these and his other disclosures, including how and to what extent the MPS targeted black justice groups, members of parliament, and trade unions in due course. For that, both he and the public will have to wait until tranche 3. But it's because of his steadfast belief in the truth that Mr. Francis remains a core participant, despite his earlier and well-known reservations about the restriction order process, which protected the cover names of a large number of officers. Most of what he knows is not caught by the restriction order process, since what he knows predates the inquiry. When the time comes, he wants to give his evidence publicly and openly, and he invites the chair to agree that this is what he should be able to do. Who is a whistleblower? Government guidance defines a whistleblower as follows. You are a whistleblower if you're a worker and you report certain types of wrongdoing. This will usually be something you've seen at work, though not always. The wrongdoing you disclose must be in the public interest. This means it must affect others, for example, the general public. As a whistleblower, you're protected by law. You should not be treated unfairly or lose your job because you blow the whistle. You can raise your concern at any time about an incident that happened in the past, is happening now, or you believe will happen in the near future. But the reality is that whistleblowers always make unwelcome revelations. That is true across the public services. The doctor who revealed the problems of the Bristol paediatric heart surgery practices was vilified and never worked in the NHS again. Police officers are office holders, but they are still workers. Mr. Francis made disclosures of wrongdoing in the public interest, and he is routinely and rightly described by the media as a whistleblower, and has been so described by counsel to the inquiry in his opening earlier this week. Whilst there are some employment law protections for whistleblowers, these have been shown to be largely illusory, and police officers like Mr. Francis are in any event bound by the Official Secrets Act. There is currently no legal protection or other support, physical, financial, or emotional, available to those who disclose wrongdoing in the public interest after they have left a job, or indeed for those who are caught by the Official Secrets Act, and or if they disclose in the public domain. In a recent report, the Chief Executive Officer of Whistleblowers UK said, "Whistleblowers are the vital element of a transparent society. These are the people who demonstrate integrity and commitment to their organisation and the public. They should be the best friend of the CEO, as they are first line of defence against crime, corruption and cover-up. There is rarely a day when whistleblowing is not in the press. However, what often makes the story newsworthy is the treatment of the whistleblower and the impact of the failure to act on disclosures to the public at an early stage. The global pandemic provides the ultimate example of the value of whistleblowers as the key to avoiding or reversing a catastrophe. Dr. Li Wenliang's alert could have prevented hundreds of thousands of deaths and a global economic meltdown estimated to a value close to £5 trillion. Mr. Francis is a whistleblower. He's not yet been prosecuted for his disclosures, but neither has he been told that he will not be. He has never been officially recognised by the MPS as a whistleblower for his past public interest disclosures. The irreconcilable conflict between the Official Secrets Act and the general acceptance that the whistleblowing of protected disclosures is in the public interest remains unresolved. Thus, police officers and others are in effect required by law to maintain a public silence about their knowledge of wrongdoing, even if that's affecting the public. And the police, as a public organisation, are therefore entitled to mark their own homework and hence decide if anything of past wrongdoing should be made public. The obvious conflicts of interest in such a process are clear. There are plenty of carpets in the MPS, and they have been liberally used in the past to cover up wrongdoing. And it's an issue that we say this inquiry will have to grapple with in due course. Whilst the book, Undercover, The True Story of Britain's Secret Police by Rob Evans and Paul Lewis describes some of Mr. Francis's time in the SDS and some of his deployments, his own detailed account has not yet been sought by the inquiry. The inquiry has chosen to work its way linearly through the chronology of events. This is despite the fact that his evidence is likely to be of general assistance to the inquiry, whatever period is examining. And sadly, this is also despite his often expressed need for closure, which the witness-taking process would go some way towards attaining. Some 5 years in, he still awaits the formal request for a witness statement under Rule 9 of the inquiry rules, as well as his witness pack. He wants to speak formally through the inquiry process, but it does not wish to hear from him anytime soon. And this is a source of real upset and concern to him. After all, it was his disclosures, his account to the Ellison Review that triggered this inquiry. As is now known, the SDS operated for the majority of existence without legislative legitimacy or judicial oversight. The intelligence gathered was sanitized, so no prosecuting authority or a judge was aware of the role of undercover officers. And as Mr. Francis revealed 2 decades later, a number of officers were arrested and prosecuted in their fake IDs. Mr. Francis has said publicly on numerous occasions, "I now think that no undercover officer should be targeting political campaigners." He is strongly of the view that such a draconian incursion into the lives of ordinary people in the UK, expressing peaceable political opposition to the actions of the government of the day or those of foreign governments, is wholly unjustified. Mr. Francis believes, as I said earlier, that undercover policing can be a legitimate policing tool. He considers it essential to effectively combating serious organised crime and proscribed terrorist organisations. However, he considers that there is a level of serious criminality that must be reached before the state is justified in using the tactics of undercover police officers. Potential crimes must pose a serious and substantial threat to our society before undercover policing can ever be justified. He recognised that what constitutes a serious and substantial threat to society will change according to the political and social landscape. Reading the SDS annual reports now, though, even through a 21st century lens, it beggars belief that the women's liberation movement or the Croydon libertarians could ever have been thought to pose a serious threat to society. There must be always objective evidence of such a threat. Additionally, and obviously, there must be a highly regulated governance system with ultimate accountability residing with an independent judiciary. Of course, as you've heard from the MPS, the systems are now in place and they are completely different to when Mr. Francis was an undercover police officer. But that does not mean that the systems in place now are sufficient to prevent wrongdoing. He feels that undercover police work continues to lack proper, detailed and rigorous scrutiny from a judge whose task is to ask whether the actions of the state are justifiable on a day-to-day basis. The role of the judge can only be to scrutinise the actions of the police on behalf of those who are being deceived, to be their voice in the system, to ensure that the state-sponsored deception is justified. It will often be justified where there is serious crime, but the system needs a high and continuous level of scrutiny. This inquiry is about what can go wrong when there is a lack of governance. Not only does it bring the police into disrepute, it can destroy human lives, both those of the surveillance targets and those of the officers asked to act in the line of duty. The system failed in numerous ways before, and the job of the inquiry is, so far as possible, that it does not fail in other ways in the future. In closing, Mr. Francis considers that any proper governance arrangements must, at the very minimum, A, recognise the impact of undercover policing on those persons who were not committing serious crimes, that were not serious and substantial threats to our society, and have an open system of offering explanations to those who were adversely affected, and the opportunity for those affected to seek compensation for having been misled by state agents. This might, for example, include a statutory scheme for compensation for those innocently targeted. B, provide for judicial oversight of an ongoing undercover policing activity, both when planned, when being carried out, and on review once completed. C, provide a proper, structured mechanism for whistleblowing for both current and ex-employees, so that there is a viable way to disclose malpractice without the threat of sanctions under the Official Secrets Act. D, provide that support should be provided, crucially including psychiatric support for both serving and former officers, given that conditions such as post-traumatic stress disorder are lifelong psychiatric conditions with which undercover officers have to live. That's all Mr. Francis wishes to say in opening, sir. He's grateful for the opportunity to say it, and he looks forward to giving evidence in detail on his experiences in due course.
Thank you, Mr. Locke. He will have that opportunity. I apologise to him for the time it has taken before the inquiry has been able to approach him with as full a package of relevant documents as it can assemble. The task has not proven easy.
I don't underestimate that, sir, and I'm sure Mr. Francis will be extremely grateful for that candid apology.